Hello and welcome everyone to this Achates live session on Thursday, the 10th of November 2022. Achates is a strategy, fundraising and recruitment company, and Achates Live is our monthly webinar series to support the cultural sector. Deborah Larwood, our Director of Development, will be leading today's discussion, and our technology and chat is being handled by General Manager Victoria Hibbs, so please do send in your questions. Today's session will focus on how to adapt and evolve when your strategic and creative approach doesn't quite go to plan. We know that fundraising for the cultural sector combines a number of elements, from data insight and analysis to strong relationship management, as well as a clear organisational purpose and articulation of the value your work is driving and for who. However, despite the best planned approach, fundraising is both relationship-based and informed by wider cultural strategy, and sometimes your end result won't quite be what you anticipated, predicted, or expected. We'd like to acknowledge that we know this is a position that is being keenly felt by organisations across the cultural sector this week, following Arts Council England's MPO announcement last Friday. What we will do in today's session is think about how you rebuild your approach to go again. We know the cultural sector is resilient, and that particular strength has been demonstrated time and time again over the last very few challenging years. But we also know that more challenges lie ahead, and that organisations will need to be increasingly flexible with the ability to welcome change and adaptations. Today, we welcome three panellists who will reflect on their fundraising challenges, and they will share how they have recatalyzed their approach and what tools, assets, and stakeholders they require to successfully pivot. Our panellists today join us from three very different cultural organisations representing theatre, dance and literature, all with significantly different income models representing a range of levels of public investment. Let me introduce you to our panel. First up, Olivia Hyland, who is Co-Director of Development at the Old Vic. Olivia has worked in a range of directing, producing, stage management and theatre education roles, both in London and regionally. Olivia joined the Old Vic in 2011, working in various positions within the corporate development team, and now holds the title of Co-Director of Development, where she is responsible for developing and leading the Old Vic's fundraising strategy and a 15-strong team to deliver ambitious revenue and capital fundraising targets and to build sustainable long-term growth in philanthropic and corporate support. Additionally, as a member of the senior management team, Olivia contributes to the overall strategic planning and management of this iconic independent theatre, which operates as a registered charity receiving no regular government subsidy. Given the Old Vic's funding model, much innovation and adaptation has been required over the organisation to sustain the theatre and donor partner relations over the last couple of years. Welcome and hello, Olivia.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this very important and timely conversation. Thank you.
Well, great to have you with us. Thank you, Olivia. Next up, we welcome Claire Shanahan, Director of the Women's Prize Trust. Claire leads the Women's Prize Trust, having previously worked on the Women's Prize for Fiction for 7 years during her time as Head of Arts at Book Trust. As Director, Claire is responsible for strategy, business planning, partnerships, delivery of programmes and projects, and the day-to-day operations. Named a Bookseller Rising Star in 2013, Claire began her career in publishing as an editor at Pearson and Hachette before moving to the charity sector. Claire has run the BBC Short Story Awards for over a decade and sits on the advisory panel of Nesta's Alternatives programme. Claire is a passionate advocate of the transformative power of reading and writing and the ongoing need to invest in and cheerlead women. Hello and welcome, Claire.
Hi, Helen. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you with us. And finally, we welcome Jennifer Young, Development Director at Northern Ballet. Jennifer has worked in destination management and culture for over 16 years, and she has held senior management roles, including as Head of Visitor Experience for Visit Birmingham, and more recently as Head of Visitor Economy and Inward Investment for Visit Leeds. Jennifer's passion for dance led her to joining Northern Ballet in 2018 as Director of Development, leading the team to achieve ambitious targets as the company expanded its digital work and celebrated its 50th anniversary. Northern Ballet is the widest touring ballet company in the UK, and its primary aim is to promote the joy of dancing to as wide an audience as possible. The world-class dance facilities at their base in Leeds is also home to the Academy of Northern Ballet, the leading centre of excellence for dance in the north of England, which provides gifted young dancers with access to the highest quality training. Jennifer is also trustee for the Mark Bruce Company. Hello and welcome, Jennifer.
Hello, and thank you for having me. Looking forward to talking about everything today.
Great, thank you so much for joining us. Now I'm going to pass over to Deborah, who's going to set the context for this afternoon's discussion.
Thank you so much, Helen, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us this afternoon. If you've ever been part of a network or a fundraising special interest group, you'll likely be familiar with the reassuring feeling of the closed door conversation, or the Chatham House rules. The fact that we use those protected spaces to gather together and speak of the challenges that we're facing or the things that haven't quite gone to plan is a signal perhaps that we're not so comfortable with being uncomfortable. As fundraisers and fundraising organisations, we're focused on success because we're agents for change. That is to say that we are asking for the change we want to see in the world, and the philanthropic gift or the money we're requesting is the vehicle which can enable that change to happen, as it facilitates our organisations to further their mission or purpose for the communities that they benefit. As Helen mentioned, we base our fundraising on an alchemy of factors, from data to relationships to policy. And in a sector where we must apply our often lean resources in the most effective ways in order to maximise our impact, the stakes can feel high with little room for error. But things don't always go to plan. Giving habits change, internal factors shift, or indeed other environmental factors come into play. And it's not always easy to predict when those moments are going to come to pass. To my mind, being able to identify when a moment has arrived, when an approach is not working, or a tried and tested model appears to become less effective, being able to regroup and change course requires an element of bravery, because you've got not only to change your strategy or the approach, but you need to bring your colleagues, your advocates, or even your donors with you. The fact remains that this happens to us all to some degree in our work. And my hope is that we can use today's discussion to surface some of those stories and to learn from them. Not only learning how organisations dealt with being faced with these challenges, but how they became more resilient and how they embraced the opportunity to evolve, to adapt, and to go again. Now, I'm really delighted to have our three fantastic panellists with us today to explore the topic. And so if I may, I'd like to begin by handing over to each of you in turn to tell us a little bit about your experience of the need for adaptability and to share some insights into how you've recalibrated or pivoted your work to find a different route to achieve fundraising success. And lastly, what advice, if any, you'd share with others who are facing similar challenges. I'd like to, if I may, come to you first, Olivia, to talk a little bit about your experience here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Deborah. So just to give some context, as Helen said, I'm the co-director of development at the Old Vic. We have a team of 14 full-time and 1 additional part-time. Our kind of general revenue target is around 3 to 4 million a year. Currently, in addition to that, we're also fundraising for a £17 million capital campaign. So there's plenty to do, as I'm sure is the feeling felt by all fundraising teams at the moment. And I suppose to give context of our kind of fundraising model, you know, we operate in quite an unusual way in the sense that we don't receive any regular government subsidy, although I know following Friday's announcement that there are sadly others in the same boat. And I suppose really our box office accounts for about 2/3 of what we need to bring in, and then the rest is required fundraising. So I suppose as a fundraiser and heading up the team, it's a very galvanizing kind of challenge. It's not a nice to have, it's an essential to our business model. And actually, I think the real virtue of that is that we are very central to that organisation and therefore interplay and work very closely with all the other departments in the organisation. And for me personally, so I became co-director of development at the Old Vic in January 2020, alongside my co-director, Sam Morley. And so we had a lovely kind of opening. We had a really productive and positive away day with our team. And then the pandemic struck, pretty much less than 3 months that we'd been in role. And so it was like essentially throwing out the fundraising handbook, because it felt like all of the ingredients that you normally rely upon to help you create the kind of perfect kind of successful fundraising criteria were disappearing overnight, really, as we closed our doors. So the fact that we didn't have a show, we had no assets to sell, essentially. We had no assets or vehicle to deliver contractual benefits, and we hadn't got that opportunity for the face-to-face contact with our donors and indeed with prospects, which, as we all know, is so vital to fundraising. So as I say, it was like, you know, the rule book was out the window and we absolutely had to rethink and pivot very, very quickly. And I think maybe the reason why I don't look back on that period of time with kind of complete dread, and almost with a slight degree of affection, is because I think the success of some elements in that period is down to the fact that as an organisation, we all really grouped together, and we were all essentially fighting for the survival of the Old Vic. And, you know, I've been reflecting, obviously, in advance of today, but ever since the pandemic, really, that actually when you're in a difficult situation, the sooner that you can bring other stakeholders on board to share that challenge and essentially to get them invested in helping you find the solution, I think is one of my big takeaways from the pandemic. Because actually people, you know, if they feel that they're involved and kind of committed to finding that solution, then you're going to get to that end point sooner and more productively. And I suppose I do have some, you know, specific, I suppose, positives or silver linings that I like to think of with regards to the pandemic. You know, as I said, we'd lost our asset base overnight as we closed our doors. So as an organisation without subsidy, we had to think of a way to survive. And it was a bit of a creative punt, an idea from our artistic director, Matthew Watchus, who decided that we would live stream productions from the empty auditorium at the Old Vic. And we did that initially with Lungs, with Matt Smith and Claire Foy. And we decided that we would try to appeal to people's kind of philanthropic, compassionate nature. And we priced those tickets just as we would if you were in our auditorium, albeit that everyone is on their sofa having the same view. And actually, it was a huge success, and we couldn't have predicted that, really. And really critically, from the fundraising team's perspective, is it suddenly gave us those valuable assets again on which we could start delivering benefits to our donors. And indeed, you know, I'm thinking to our principal partner, we could give them branding opportunities again, or our previews partner, we were able to offer those £10 tickets for PwC across those productions. So suddenly, whilst our doors went open, we were slightly alive and kicking again, which felt absolutely vital. And I suppose on the other kind of side of the coin with the Old Vic, we've always had this kind of dual identity of artistic and social mission work. And we immediately saw that the pandemic was going to hit, you know, the beneficiaries of our social mobility, education and community projects hardest of all. And so we worked really hard, very quickly, with the budget of, you know, on a shoestring, to transpose our projects online as swiftly as we could. And that for us was actually something that, you know, we'd kind of longed to do. We talked about it a lot, and actually the pandemic just had to make it happen. So there are some, you know, when your back is against the wall, I think it propels us to do those things that, as you say, need a bit of courage and need a bit of push. And actually, there's been real successes off the back of that. And I think my kind of final piece of silver lining, because I'm determined to take the positives away from this kind of ordeal that I know the whole sector has had to endure, is that I think as a, globally, but certainly, nationally, it's encouraged people to really understand the value of the arts. It's a huge driver to our economy. It's a huge employer. But also it has a huge impact on our creativity and our well-being as individuals. And so I think that sometimes in these moments that feel dire and desperate and are crises, there will emerge some silver linings that we can take forward and learn from and develop and hone, and find the positives. So that's my kind of story into heading up the team and having to pivot pretty immediately.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I think if ever there was a time when it was about pivoting and thinking again, the pandemic, as I'm sure many people watching will feel as well, was a real moment to test our mettle, to be able to do that. Just to pick up on a few points, beautifully made, if I may. I really like what you were saying about the opportunity for the organisation to grow together through a challenge, and also the point you were making about it's a moment where you can bring your stakeholders with you to bring them into finding the solutions and the through route. I think that's sort of engagement at its finest.
Absolutely.
But also, thinking about how in those moments you can demonstrate that as an organisation you are committed to furthering your work for your beneficiaries. Incredibly compelling, I think, from a fundraising point of view. And lastly, I think what really struck me from what you were saying in terms of filming an empty auditorium was you found a way to engage your supporters and wider audiences in a fashion that really spoke to your organisational distinctiveness and your asset, which, your beautiful space and the work that you create. So thank you so much for sharing with us. I'm going to move us along to Jennifer now from Northern Ballet to share some thoughts that aren't necessarily linked to the pandemic, but nevertheless, I think, Jennifer, are moments in time where you've had to respond to a challenge.
Hi, yes. Just to put a bit of context, so Northern Ballet, we're typically an £8 to £9 million company. Obviously, that's flexed slightly during the pandemic. And since fundraising, we are asked to bring in, we need to bring in about between £1 and £1.5 million a year. Typically, box office income is very crucial to that. So we're looking at pushing 3 million on that. But actually, fundraising has been above box office income over the past couple of years. It's definitely switching back now to a normal pattern, but obviously been huge pressure on us to bring in income increasingly. But I want to take you back to a time before the pandemic, when Northern Ballet was turning 50. So we had huge plans, a year of celebrations planned, really starting from autumn 2019 through to the following year. So you can see what then happened. Huge plans, huge celebration, and the whole of the company galvanised behind that. And in that also, our national stage and screen sponsor was going to play a hugely pivotal role. We'd had a relationship with them for a very long time, which had grown. And in the last year or so, it actually became stage and screen because our digital work was hugely taking off. Cinemas across the world and the UK, and digital platforms, etc. And that was our strategy: on stage, on screen. But then politics took over, and we voted to leave the EU. So Brexit hit that summer, and our national stage and screen sponsor, their budgets were drastically slashed based on the impacts of the pandemic that their global holding company predicted. Marketing and advertising budgets are critical to sponsorship, and they had to make a very, very hard decision. And literally overnight, we lost this 6-figure sponsor. And we were in contract, but there was a clause to get out. They desperately didn't want to do it, but they had to do it. So suddenly we're going into all of this activity where we'd planned to spend that money, and it was finishing suddenly at the end of the year. So we'd go into our big anniversary year, no huge sponsor. And that sponsor, really valuable to us. Events all across our tours. We've got big lorries touring all across the UK, branded up. Very, very detailed Marcoms campaign working with them. So the reach, very crucial and monitored by them. So actually we had to suddenly get the branding off. So there was so much work in it, but actually time it just to when their contract finished as well. I think it was a time also where locally to us, Leeds Playhouse had a huge refurbishment work. We were supporting them as part of their big opening season. And on Halloween, we were performing Dracula, a revival, and we were live streaming that to cinemas from stage to screen it went to about 350 different cinemas. So again, that was a pinnacle with that partner. So it was actually the best time for that partner, but they were leaving us. Really hard for their staff, really hard for our staff internally. I think there was a lot of panic. Where was the replacement of the income going? How could we deliver the activity that we'd planned? So it was actually really getting a grip of things and don't panic, and quickly pivoting and actually thinking, right, okay, quickly warming up some of the pipeline of corporate sponsors, which we hadn't been able to work with because of this exclusion clause we had. So quickly get them engaged, use everything we could, but you can see what then happened. Pandemic. And actually, we wouldn't have been able to fulfill that contract anyway. We would have, there would have been financial clawbacks. It wouldn't have happened. It would have changed anyway. And we would have, lost that income. And so actually, it was just calm. It was just the way it worked. And obviously, we used the pandemic similarly. We really pushed our digital. We did a lot of pay-as-you-feel work. So we actually switched to a lot of digital fundraising. But maybe we weren't so switched on or experienced at. Maybe we're thinking, all right, we'll monetize the digital work. But actually we didn't fundraise so much using it, but then we did. And I would say actually our corporate sponsorship now is starting to really recover because we can now deliver those events on tour, which is so important for a lot of our sponsors. So it's turning a page, and actually we pivoted more, focused more on individual giving, digital fundraising, and really big push on the trusts and foundations. And we were fine. And it was okay. So there you go.
Thanks, Jennifer. Good. It's I think on paper, of course, I'm sure lots of people were reacting as you were telling the recounting what happened. That is one of the sort of worst nightmares of any fundraiser, organization, etc. Especially when you're talking about a partnership at that level. The stakes are high and there is risk associated with those larger partnerships. But you're absolutely right. The key is panic doesn't really get us anywhere. It's about trying to steady the ship, take stock of where you are, what is in your control and what isn't in your control, and look for the opportunities. I think, you talked about, well, actually, perhaps that then opened up the opportunity to work with businesses that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise been able to have engaged with because of that sponsorship. Or, for example, you pivoted and turned towards other streams of giving and you developed your individual giving and you used digital channels. There is always another way of addressing the issue of finding that financial resource. But the key thing is, in the moment, easy as it is to say, and I think it's probably very difficult to do, is just trying to be calm and to find a creative response to the challenge, because we are creative organizations. We are creative by our nature. And I suppose it's about trying to harness that creativity and work together to find a way through. Thank you for sharing your experience of that with us today.
Yeah, and I think something I probably didn't mention is we really fulfilled the remainder of that portion of that contract, to the highest standards. We kept in touch with the team, and guess what? We're working with them again now, but on a smaller scale. So, huge respect for them and the way, what they had to deal with, and us, so we got through it as a partnership. So that would be my advice, just see it through, maintain a really good relationship, and you never know what comes out the other side.
Indeed. Thank you, Jennifer. That's fantastic. Claire, last but not least, let's come to you next and hear your experience of evolving and adapting in the face of a challenge.
Thank you, Deborah. And thank you, Olivia and Jennifer. I was nodding away through all of that, sort of going, yes, that was terrible. And, oh no, we've all been there. just to explain a little bit more about the Women's Prize Trust before I give my examples. So we are a relatively new charity, very small in comparison to the other panelists. So the Women's Prize Trust, we champion equity of opportunity for women in the world of books. We fundamentally believe that books by women can change the world, and never has that been more needed. We are, as I said, a small charity, so we're a team of 5 with a very active board, luckily. We only have 1 full-time member of staff. We have no office, and our turnover is 600 grand a year. So really, really small in comparison. We're also new. So we became a registered charity in 2018, although we are most well known for the Women's Prize for Fiction, which is an annual literary prize, which is now in its 28th year. And for a small team, we tend to punch above our weight. And that's largely through, I think, utilising digital and sort of galvanising digital communities of women around the world to sort of look bigger than the sum of our parts. So, for example, our last sort of annual cycle, our social media reach for the whole year will be 56 million. And our print UK media coverage in the traditional sense of print and broadcast for our winner announcement, which is one of the key beats every year for our sort of big activity, was 164 million. So we utilize sort of technology as best we can. And I think that comes from our PR and marketing backgrounds. Essentially, a literary prize is a promotion. It's there to drive awareness of particular authors and sell their books. So changing and transforming into a registered charity was an amazing opportunity, but also an incredible challenge. I came on board to sort of lead that transformation, and always was very clear with the board that it was a sort of 5-year plan. And 2 years into that, we were in a pandemic, and it was more about survival. My example actually straddles Olivia's and Jennifer's examples. Of course, the pandemic as a context, but it was our 25th anniversary of the Women's Prize for Fiction, which for us was a huge moment. Just like Jennifer, we had huge plans, we had contractual obligations. We were deliberately and proactively moving from a 100% commercial sponsorship model to much more of a mixed model, to minimize risk, really, and to engage an individual donor base, and then starting to sort of step into trusts and foundations. And that all went asunder. We had 3 commercial sponsors at headline level, and one of them exercised their break clause. So that was devastating, to be honest, really, really devastating. We also, just had the everyday challenges of how to deliver projects in this new world, in this new reality. And I think as individuals, what really helped us was, I think, as Olivia was saying, sort of just sharing, being human, and who we all were and what we were going through. You're sort of led into people's lives and people's homes, and trying to sort of go through it together, problem solve it together. And I think, as Olivia said, sharing that with stakeholders, at all levels, being really honest with proactive communication and trying to solve it together really, really helped us. So in terms of how we pivoted away from a full annual celebration, a big media moment for us, a programme of live events, and bringing international authors to London for a celebration, we had to pivot. So we did a range of things. We held back on virtual events. We wanted to watch and see what everyone was doing and how it was going to work. And there were so many different options. Olivia mentioned sort of the old Vic strategy of price it as you would price it, being in a theatre. Other people gave their content away for free. Others kind of gently suggested, pay what you can type thing. And there were also a lot of different options available in terms of live streaming. Some did feel live, and there were techie challenges. Some kind of pretended to be live, but you thought that was too slick. That was definitely a pre-record. It was, you know, a kind of watch and see. And that competitor analysis was really, really useful for us. And we felt then when we actually went to market with a virtual program that was very high quality, both in terms of the programming, the content, and the production values, we were really confident in our offering, and our audience responded to that and supported it very well, as opposed to a live events program. That worked really well for us. The other thing in terms of fundraising particularly is, you know, as you know, with any big anniversary moment, it's a fundraising opportunity as well. It's thinking about that legacy into the next 25 years. For us, our strategy was high net worth. We really wanted to focus on expanding our individual giving program to really bring in a range of high net worth relationships that would be long serving for us, that we would build really close, intimate relationships with. Without the opportunity to entertain them, to get them face to face, it was really, really challenging. We managed to maintain relationships with all of our existing donors through conversations, with picking up the phone and talking to them. And people really appreciated that, I think. It sounds so simple, that honest communication, but often I think in a world of email, actual phone calls really, really helped, and people just feeling that you were making the time to talk to them. And it was me on the end of the phone. You know, I had not many, as I'm sure the other organizations had, maybe 30 calls to make. I was heavily pregnant. It was a heat wave, and I had builders in my house when they could be in, when it wasn't lockdown. It was a really intense period of time. And so people, I think, respond to that. You know, they really appreciate that. But what it meant in terms of the high net worth individual events was we obviously abandoned that strategy for prospects, and we moved to a crowdfunding campaign. So we wanted to commemorate somehow and sort of engage our audience online with the 25th anniversary. We devised a Reading Women campaign, which made the best use of our backlist. So we obviously had 24 winners, and we're about to crown the 25th. So we did a digital campaign encouraging people to read all the winners. Book sales luckily did really well through the pandemic because everyone was sitting at home. Despite the high street suffering, those retailers who could sell books online did actually benefit. Publishing did well through the pandemic. So that was one thing, that people were reading. So what it meant for us was that we decided to crowdfund for a journal, a commemorative notebook that was, you know, beautifully designed, so that people would feel part of it, that they were contributing to us as a charity, but they would also have something. That did really, really well. It was a steep learning curve. We didn't know much about crowdfunding, and we, you know, were sort of guided through it by the Unbound platform. But we smashed our target, which was a very modest £19,000, and we made 23. But that for us was really, I think, a special moment, because we realized that there was an audience who were willing to sort of invest in us as a brand. So from there, we started very slowly expanding our merchandise line, which has become a key part of our brand identity, really. So that has been a brilliant learning for us as an opportunity. It's fun, it's playful, we really enjoy it, people seem to enjoy it. And we were very fortunate that our relationships with individuals and the majority of our commercial sponsors stayed with us. In terms of takeaways, I am a data geek, so I would always say, look at the numbers. We were really, really tracking where people were kind of falling off on our journeys in terms of digital journeys. So if we were selling them something like a ticket or you know, new content that we were trying through our newsletter, how was it performing? Where were we losing them? What wasn't working? And actually being honest about that. I think the whole period was test and fail better, you know, just constantly looking at it and trying to have conversations with experts, with people who knew better than we did, who we had to draw into this kind of new way of being and operating. So we really were trying to be as agile as possible. That for me is the key takeaway. And I think going forward, we have definitely built data analysis much more into our everyday in terms of the sort of looking and learning and the sucking and seeing. and not being afraid to stop something if it's not working, or being really honest and say that copy didn't work. Why did we all miss it? It, you know, didn't sell, or it was too niche, or whatever. So that is my key learning.
Thank you so much, Claire. Fantastic. There's so much in there that you've already given us, and I'm keen to try and tease out a little bit more in our onward discussion. If I may just pick out just a few things from that really helpful and rich insight that you've given us. The first thing I think is that it's okay to say that it can feel devastating. And I think to have that human response when things don't go well is totally normal, because we care and we're trying to achieve change. But it is about problem solving it together, which I think is something that all three of our panelists have talked really beautifully about today. I was also really taken by what you said around temperature checking, competitor analysis, you know, not necessarily jumping straight in with a response, but just taking a little bit of time to assess the landscape, because I suppose fast response is not always the best response. That's a really important thing, I think. And the last thing, and I think, again, this has sort of been replicated throughout everything that's been shared so far, is it's the relationships that carry you through. And it's where you've taken the time to invest in relationships with integrity that's enabled an organisation to, yes, you might have seen a dip or a challenge, but if you've embedded a relationship in an honest and meaningful way, then that relationship should persevere. I'm really conscious that as you've all been talking and sharing your insights, we'll have had some questions thrown in from viewers watching. But before I pass back to Helen so that she can pose a couple of those questions to you, I've just got two questions that I'd love to ask myself. The first question is, when there are ongoing pressures to invest resources wisely and to achieve what are often challenging targets, how do you within your organisation create the space to test and maybe even to fail? Jennifer, could I come to you on that first, if I may?
Yes. So I think creating this space is it's challenging. And I think to create that space, you have some internal stakeholders who need to give you the space to do that. And those could be peers, management team, board members, etc. And for them to understand why you're doing it. I was thinking probably this Christmas, we're not going to go all out on the big give. Whereas actually a board member, you know, they've supported it by giving us our match fund previously, but actually there's a reason behind it because of what's going to come afterwards. So I think just making it really, really clear that they understand why, but we will be doing some testing work probably to Christmas, and because it's strategic as to why. So yeah, the context there, but I think it is challenging, and particularly at the moment because fundraising targets, you know, you've got to, you know, all the pressures on, particularly after last week's news, hit target, exceed target, where's the pipeline, grow the pipeline, etc. You know, I think we're under a lot of pressure at the moment.
Yeah, I quite agree. Thank you, Jennifer. Olivia, what are your thoughts on how you create the space within your team at the Old Vic to test and maybe to fail?
I think, you know, I think I absolutely agree with Jennifer that you need to be afforded the space often by stakeholders internally. And, you know, I think we are all feeling the pressure. And I think in an organisation when there is no kind of buffer of any kind of subsidy, that is a difficult thing to argue for, the space for potential failure. And I think actually the way I would maybe sometimes reposition it is finding different measures of success. So, for example, next year we are hosting our first annual fundraiser since we closed our doors and reopened. So we had to can our 2020 gala with great sadness. And we are, you know, we have budgeted conservatively in terms of the income, because I think it's a new world out there, and it would be before the, you know, recent shenanigans with, you know, the government and the kind of current economic climate that we're finding ourselves in. And so we've, you know, budgeted quite cautiously, quite conservatively. And so whilst of course there is significant income, it may not be that it smashes the previous year that we've, or previous years that we've done. And that was an education piece for our trustees, particularly, I suppose, to get that over the line and say, okay, so fundraising and bringing in income is one measure of success for this evening, but we've had 2 years of hiatus, essentially, where we haven't been able to do the fundamentals of fundraising, which is about taking your existing donors on a journey, building and solidifying those relationships, and indeed forging new ones. And so equally as important to raising funds that evening is about building and diversifying our pipeline, which has had to be a bit static over the last couple of years, because we spent so much time and energy just trying to keep our existing supporters happy and retained. And so there's been as I say, a big education piece about identifying the different measures of success, that it won't all be signed, sealed, delivered and ticked off as a successful night on that night. It's about the the aftermath and the longevity and the legacy of that, and the relationships that come out of that. So I suppose, I think it's sometimes hard, I think, internally to say, can I have some space to potentially fail? But actually, I think if you say, can I have some space to try something out where this is one element which we can measure it by, but here are all these other metrics, and that is also super important for our organization and our needs at the moment. So I think that's the way that we've kind of approached that and spun it to get what we need to do over the line internally.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Olivia. It really resonates. And I think it's sometimes in the sort of pressure of the finances, it is quite easy, I think, to just focus on the bottom line and on the what's hit the bank account. But I couldn't agree with you anymore. Success is myriad ways in which we can achieve success, and fundraising isn't merely about the balance sheet ultimately. I've only got time for one more question before I hand back to Helen. So Claire, I'd love to come to you on this, because you mentioned being a data geek, and I wondered, how do you take your organisational learning forward and factor it into future fundraising to maximise success? So is there an element of monitoring and evaluation and sort of iterating your processes as you move forward?
Yes, absolutely. I think we're constantly evaluating what we're doing. I mean, I think as an organisation that is very accustomed to corporate paymasters, if you like, so we were traditionally on a one headline sponsor move. We had Orange as the Women's Prize for Fiction sponsor for 16 years, and we're very fortunate to have such a successful art sponsorship. We are used to reporting, but obviously the metrics are very different. So as well as marketing and PR and impressions and sales and all those traditional sort of metrics, we are also now looking at social impact, and much more in a sort of narrative sense. It's quotes, and it's it's people sharing people's stories of how we've helped and supported them, and sort of what that change has mean, and where they are on their journey, as opposed to where they've come from. And I think that needs to become a sort of everyday cultural thing within an organization, to be able to really embed that, because I think sometimes monitoring and evaluation can be seen as an add-on, and as basically as a bit of a bore, a chore and a task that's like, okay, we've done the activity, what's the next thing? And it's like, no, we have not finished the activity, and we're not moving on to the next thing until we actually look at how it performed. And I think taking that on board as a culture, as a general tone, really then underpins how you operate as a team, because there cannot be any sense of a blame culture, or well, this didn't work well, why didn't it work well? I think it's really interrogating everything you're doing alongside the competitor analysis that I mentioned, and watching sort of the landscape, and the landscape you're in, and other totally different industries, to see what's happening over there as well, and sort of what you can nab. So I think it does become part of sort of the organization psyche. And I think your board definitely needs to allow that as well, sort of adding to what Olivia was saying. I think that sort of, you know, you can try and be as ambitious as you can, coupled with the sort of risk aversion, the sort of really wanting to be conservative and set your budgets low, so then hopefully you can smash them. You know, we all do that. But equally, if there's this shared understanding across the organization of where you are, of what you're trying to do, the different ways in which you're measuring success, and a sort of like a framework or a protocol then for sort of decision making and kind of knowing where your boundaries are when you step too far, when you have really failed and it's a very serious failure, or sort of halfway along and you're sort of measuring and you're sort of saying, okay, well, we're going to try and do this now. Well, this isn't working, so let's go over here. If you scenario plan as best you can all those options, and there's a general understanding within the organization that it's not, there's no blame thing. It is a sort of suck it and see. And, you know, Elizabeth Day's podcast, which I love, that sort of fail better mentality. It's like, it's all learning. There is no failure. I really think that can help you move forward as an organization. And it just means that it's much more enjoyable. There is joy in the failure. It's sort of all taking you in the general direction with a few twists and turns along the way of what you're trying to achieve.
Lovely. I love that, Claire. And Failing Well. What's that podcast called? What did you say it was called?
It's How to Fail by Elizabeth Day.
Good. Made a note of that. Thank you. Okay. I've certainly taken more time than I ought to have done. I'm really keen that you're able to answer some questions from the floor. So I'm going to pass back to Helen so that she can put a couple of those to you. Thanks, Helen.
What an interesting discussion, and we've got some wonderful questions here. And I'd love to put one to you, if I may, around the decision-making process. I know today we've heard a lot about kind of how decisions are informed by a range of influences and acumen and experience versus kind of the hard data and pipeline and kind of previous planning. And this question we've had in is around, based on your experiences, who would you recommend is involved in that decision-making? And if I may come to you, Olivia.
I guess to some degree it depends what the decision in question is in regards to. But I think I'm a real believer in involving, you know, as many relevant stakeholders as possible, because I think, you know, to Deborah's point earlier, we are all lucky enough to work in creative organizations with passionate creative individuals alongside us who are really good at what they do. And, you know, there is the real value of diversity of thought and ideas. And I think, you know, often a problem shared is a problem halved. You know, there's a reason for that phrase. And, you know, I do refer back to the pandemic, that I feel that decisions were made more collaboratively, I think, than the old Vic has ever worked. And some of our most innovative ideas probably came out of that moment. And, you know, when you are against the wall, you're encouraged to do that. But you can do that best when you have more heads on it. So I guess my advice, certainly internally, is share that challenge or that opportunity. I think that's the other way to look at it. I guess one of the things that I would always recommend is, when you find yourself in a crisis, do a SWOT analysis. Look at the strengths and the weaknesses and the opportunities and the threats, because there will be positives to harness if we just step back and take a moment. And then I think to kind of garner the support and the insight from as many people who have slightly different expertise to you across the business. And then I think when those decisions are going to impact a donor, a supporter, I think it's bringing them into that conversation as early as you possibly can. I think, Claire, you spoke about it, a lot, that there's a real human sense of communication that has been ushered in by the pandemic, which I think we all really welcome. You know, I think before perhaps we felt we had to be a bit careful about the amount of information, particularly financial information, about our organizations with donors. And actually, I think sometimes being really honest about the precariousness of your situation, people go, wow, okay, I didn't quite realize it was so tough, and I really care about this organization, or the campaign that you're involved in, and I want to see it succeed and survive and thrive, and I'm invested in helping you do that. So I think that honesty with external stakeholders, where you can be, I think as early as possible is actually really valuable.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Olivia. And I think I really resonate with your thinking on just like how we can come together as a team across organisations to think about that, but in particular thinking about telling the story of cultural organisations as charities. And I think we have become more adept at that, and thinking about how are we honest with our communities around what that situation is. So I think that's a really interesting thought. I've got one final question which I'm just going to put out to you all, which is just about it's thinking about what other sectors can we learn from? Are there any examples? And I think that podcast, How to Fail by Elizabeth Day, really resonates with a few of us today. But thinking about other sectors, are there any examples anyone would like to share about other situations where companies or organisations have had to pivot that you think we could learn from in the cultural sector? I can see some thinking faces. Claire, if I may, I'm going to come to you.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a really concrete example. I think books in general, I mean, they straddle sort of education and entertainment. So I'm trying to think of, what are the other examples? I think if I think about the sort of new wave of streaming companies, of television companies, and even Audible, the sort of content so they originally start out as a platform, showcasing other people's content, but quite quickly we've seen, particularly over say the last 5 years, the development of their own content and really aligning that sort of commissioning of very high quality content, perhaps in a with a particular bent, a sort of particular theme, into their brand identity, and then sort of gathering their consumers to them. I think for the Women's Prize Trust, we definitely sort of use that. We're a charity, but we do try to think quite dynamically about ourselves as a brand as well, and what that brand is worth, and also the sort of monikers of a brand. That's sort of how you personally identify. So, am I a reader? Do I love going to the gym? Do I drink gin or a pint? These types of things, these really shorthand sort of social currencies that we use to think about ourselves and how we align ourselves into groups. And so that's where I think even thinking about the merchandise line or really owning our events. We used to run a lot of our events in partnership, and we're almost grateful, for service providers, if you like, to sort of help us with those. But I think thinking about them as, bringing revenue back to us and really owning those events and being able to deliver them ourselves, and therefore, benefit from all of the profit, but also all of the audience. For us, it is revenue, of course, but it's data. It's being closer, one step closer to our audience and being able to talk to them much more directly. I think is really useful. And I think, using something like sort of broadcast streaming is a good example of that, of how they're just, gradually drawing more and more sort of consumers into them and sort of keeping them, really retaining them within their platform. I think is a really good example of sort of brand development.
Wonderful. Some really great examples there. Thank you so much, Claire. Unless there's any final thoughts from our panelists, I will close the session. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Especially thank you to our panelists for being so generous with their reflections and advice on today's topic. If you are facing challenges with your fundraising, your organisational strategy, or indeed your recruitment, Achates can, of course, help. So please be in touch with us to discuss. We'll be taking a break from Achates Live in December, and so our next session will be on Thursday, the 12th of January 2023. More details to follow. Finally, today, we'd like to congratulate the winners of the Achates Philanthropy Prize, which were announced last night at Symphony Hall in Birmingham. Battersea Arts Centre and Spread the Word jointly won the crown for the Individual Giving Award, whilst the Big House was awarded the Corporate Prize. There was an absolutely stellar shortlist for both prizes, so very deserved congratulations to all our winners and of course to all the shortlisted organisations too. You can find out more about that on the Cultural Philanthropy website, but thank you so much for joining us today for this Achates Live.